In a small, quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and lush greenery, there lived a man named James Callahan. To most people, James seemed like an ordinary person, someone you might pass on the street without giving much thought to. But those who knew him well understood that beneath his calm exterior lay the heart of a true hero. James was a retired Army veteran in his late 30s, a man who had spent years serving his country with honor and bravery. However, life after the military wasn't always easy for him. The physical toll of his service lingered in ways he couldn't ignore. One of the hardest things he dealt with daily was his chronic asthma, a condition that had worsened during his time overseas. It made simple tasks challenging at times, but James refused to let it define him. Instead, he carried his inhaler everywhere, treating it as a trusted companion rather than a burden. James loved spending time outdoors, especially in the peaceful park just a short walk from his home. The park was a sanctuary for him, a place where he could escape the noise of everyday life and find solace among the trees, birds, and gentle breeze. On sunny days, children laughed as they played on the swings, couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths, and elderly folks sat on benches, sharing stories. For James, these moments were precious. They reminded him of the beauty of life and gave him a sense of purpose beyond his past struggles. But despite the tranquility the park usually offered, James couldn't shake off the feeling that something was different today. As he stepped onto the gravel path, the air felt heavier, almost charged with tension. He glanced around, noticing a group of teenagers gathered near the playground. They weren't playing or chatting casually like kids often did. Instead, they huddled together, their voices loud and boisterous, echoing through the otherwise serene environment. Empty soda cans and candy wrappers littered the ground around them, evidence of their carelessness. James sighed softly under his breath. He recognized these teens. They were regular troublemakers in the neighborhood, known for vandalizing property and causing disturbances. While he didn't want any part of their antics, he also didn't feel threatened. After all, what harm could a bunch of rowdy kids possibly do? With that thought, James decided to keep walking, hoping to slip by unnoticed. He adjusted the scarf around his neck and focused on the rhythmic crunch of his boots against the gravel, trying to block out the commotion behind him. As he moved further down the path, James allowed himself to relax slightly. He took in the golden hues of autumn leaves scattered across the ground and listened to the distant chirping of sparrows. For a moment, he forgot about the teenagers and their unruly behavior. But fate had other plans. Little did James know, his decision to take this walk would lead to an encounter that tested not only his strength, but also the kindness of strangers watching from afar. What started as a peaceful outing was about to become a story he'd never forget, one that would remind him, and everyone else involved, of the resilience of the human spirit. With the inhaler safely back in James's hands and his breathing beginning to stabilize, Sarah turned her full attention to the group of teenagers. Her presence alone was enough to keep them frozen in place, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of her authority. She took a step closer, her polished boots clicking softly against the gravel path, each sound echoing like a heartbeat in the tense silence. The teens exchanged uneasy glances, their body language shifting from defiance to discomfort. Some shuffled their feet nervously, while others avoided her gaze altogether, suddenly finding the ground or their shoes incredibly fascinating. Sarah stopped a few paces away from them, her posture straight and commanding. Though she wasn't particularly tall, her uniform gave her an imposing aura that seemed to fill the space around her. Her expression remained calm, but there was a steely determination in her eyes that left no room for doubt. She meant business. "You think this is funny?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made every word land with precision. One of the boys, clearly trying to salvage some semblance of pride, muttered defensively, "We were just messing around. No big deal." His tone faltered halfway through, betraying his attempt at confidence. Another chimed in hesitantly, "Yeah, we didn't mean anything by it." Sarah's jaw tightened ever so slightly, her patience wearing thin. She gestured toward James, who was still leaning against the bench, his face pale and his breathing shallow despite the relief provided by the inhaler. "Does he look okay to you?" she asked sharply, her voice rising just enough to emphasize her point. What if he hadn't been able to breathe? What if something worse had happened because of your messing around? The teenagers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier cockiness evaporating completely. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the gravity of what they'd done. One girl near the back of the group whispered something to her friend, her face flushed with guilt. Another boy stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his actions had finally hit him. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. "This isn't just about stealing someone's property," she continued, her tone firm but measured. "It's about respect, about understanding that your actions have consequences. You don't get to decide when something is harmless or not. It's not your call to make." She paused, letting her words sink in before adding, "And let's be clear, taking someone's medication during an asthma attack isn't harmless. It's dangerous, it's reckless, and it's unacceptable." Her gaze swept over the group, meeting each of their eyes briefly but pointedly. When she reached the leader, the one who had initially snatched the inhaler, she held his stare a little longer, ensuring he felt the full impact of her disapproval. He looked away quickly, unable to hold her gaze, his earlier bravado now replaced by shame. Without waiting for a response, Sarah stepped forward again, closing the distance between herself and the group. "You're coming with me," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. When one of the boys opened his mouth to protest, she cut him off immediately. "Do you really want to argue with me right now?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. The boy snapped his mouth shut, shaking his head mutely. Sarah motioned for them to start walking, keeping a close eye on the group as they reluctantly fell into line behind her. As they moved, she radioed for backup, ensuring that reinforcements would arrive shortly to assist in handling the situation properly. Passers-by began to notice the commotion, some stopping to watch curiously as the teenagers were escorted out of the park. A few people clapped quietly, offering Sarah approving nods, while others whispered among themselves, clearly impressed by her decisive action. Before leaving the park entirely, Sarah glanced back at James, who was slowly regaining his composure. She offered him a small, reassuring smile, a silent promise that justice would be served. Then, turning her focus back to the task at hand, she led the group toward the nearby community center where authorities would take over. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the moment. This wasn't how she had envisioned spending her afternoon patrol, but she knew she'd done the right thing. Protecting others wasn't just part of her job, it was part of who she was. And as the teenagers trudged along beside her, their heads down and their spirits deflated, she hoped they would remember this day, not as a punishment, but as a lesson. A lesson about accountability, empathy, and the importance of treating others with kindness and respect. From her position beneath the towering oak tree, Corporal Sarah Bennett had been observing the scene unfold with growing unease. At first glance, it seemed like just another group of rowdy teenagers causing mischief, something she'd encountered countless times during her patrols. But as she watched them surround James, their actions shifted from harmless teasing to something far more sinister. The shove, the stolen inhaler, and the cruel game they played with it were not mere pranks. They were acts of cruelty that bordered on outright harm. Sarah's training as a member of the Royal Guard taught her to remain vigilant, to assess situations carefully before acting. Yet there was something about this moment that tugged at her instincts in a way few things ever had. Perhaps it was the desperation etched on James's face as he struggled to breathe, or the gleeful indifference of the teenagers tossing his inhaler back and forth. Whatever it was, it stirred a deep sense of responsibility within her, a reminder that being part of the Royal Guard wasn't just about ceremonial duties or standing tall in parades. It was about protecting people, even when no one was watching. She stood silently for a while longer, studying every detail. The teenager's body language spoke volumes. confident, cocky, and completely unaware of the gravity of their actions. They laughed and jeered, treating the situation like entertainment, oblivious to the fact that James's breathing was becoming increasingly labored. She noticed how he clutched the bench for support, his knuckles white, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Every shallow gasp he took sent a jolt through her, an unspoken signal that time was running out. Sarah knew she couldn't wait any longer. Protocol dictated discretion unless directly called upon, but this wasn't a matter of protocol anymore. This was a human being in distress, and these teenagers were actively contributing to it. Her decision made, she stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of the oak tree. The gravel path crunched softly beneath her polished boots, the sound sharp enough to cut through the chaos. Heads turned instantly, and the laughter died down as all eyes landed on her. The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate. One moment, the park had been filled with the boisterous energy of unchecked arrogance. The next, an eerie silence fell over the group, broken only by James's ragged breathing. Sarah's presence commanded attention, not because she demanded it, but because her uniform carried weight. The crisp lines of her attire, the gleaming buttons, and the unmistakable bearskin hat marked her as someone who embodied authority and discipline. To the teenagers, she must have looked like a figure straight out of history books, untouchable and formidable. For a brief moment, the teens exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Their bravado faltered under her steady gaze, replaced by uncertainty. One of them finally spoke up, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "We're just messing around," he said, attempting to brush off the severity of their actions. His words hung awkwardly in the air, sounding hollow even to his own ears. Another chimed in, trying to salvage the situation. "Yeah, we didn't mean anything by it." But Sarah wasn't fooled. She arched an eyebrow slightly, her expression unyielding. "Messing around doesn't involve stealing someone's medication," she replied, her tone calm yet firm. There was no room for argument in her voice. It wasn't a question or a suggestion, but a statement of fact. Her eyes flicked toward James, who was still leaning heavily against the bench, struggling to catch his breath. Without waiting for a response, she moved closer, her movements deliberate and measured. When she reached the spot where the inhaler had been dropped during the commotion, she bent down gracefully and picked it up. Holding it gently in her hand, she approached James, ensuring she kept her body positioned between him and the group of teenagers. She handed the device to him with care, making sure he understood she was there to help. "Take your time," she said quietly, her voice softening for his benefit alone. Her words carried both reassurance and authority, reminding him, and everyone else, that he wasn't alone anymore. As James fumbled with the inhaler, Sarah kept her focus on the teenagers, her stance unwavering. Though she hadn't raised her voice or made any sudden movements, her mere presence was enough to keep them rooted in place. They shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze altogether, others glancing at each other nervously. For the first time since the confrontation began, they seemed to realize the consequences of their actions. What had started as a game had escalated into something far more serious, and now they were facing someone who wouldn't let them walk away without accountability. As James continued his leisurely stroll along the park's winding path, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The laughter and shouts from the group of teenagers grew louder, more aggressive, cutting through the peaceful ambience like a jarring note in an otherwise harmonious melody. He glanced over his shoulder briefly, catching sight of them, huddled together near the playground. They were roughhousing now, shoving each other playfully at first, but quickly escalating into something less innocent. One boy pushed another hard enough to send him stumbling backward onto the grass, drawing cheers and jeers from the rest of the group. James quickened his pace slightly, hoping to put some distance between himself and the boisterous crowd. He didn't want any trouble, just a quiet walk to clear his mind. But fate seemed determined to intervene. As he turned a corner, heading toward a quieter section of the park dotted with benches and tall oak trees, he heard footsteps behind him. At first, They were faint, almost blending with the rustling leaves and distant chatter. But soon, the sound became unmistakable. Several sets of hurried steps closing in on him. He stopped for a moment, pretending to adjust the strap of his bag while glancing sideways. Sure enough, the group of teenagers had left their spot near the playground and was now trailing him, their movements deliberate and mocking. "Hey, old man," one of them called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's the rush? We just want to talk." His words were met with snickers and giggles from the others, who hung back slightly but kept their eyes fixed on James. James forced a tight smile, though his heart began to race. He knew better than to engage. They thrived on reactions, feeding off fear or anger like predators circling prey. Instead, he nodded politely, saying nothing as he resumed walking. But the teens weren't content to let him go so easily. One of them jogged ahead, positioning himself directly in James's path. He was taller than the others, with a cocky grin plastered across his face. "Where you headed, Grandpa?" he sneered, spreading his arms wide as if blocking James's way was some kind of game. For a moment, James considered turning around, retracing his steps to avoid further confrontation. But doing so would mean walking straight past the rest of the group, who were now fanning out behind him. They had effectively surrounded him, cutting off any easy escape route. Panic began to creep in, not because of the situation itself, but because of what it could trigger. James felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a warning sign that his asthma might act up. He reached instinctively for his inhaler, clutching it tightly in his pocket as a reminder of its presence. The leader of the group stepped closer, leaning in until his face was inches away from James's. "You deaf or something?" he demanded, his tone sharper now. "I asked where you're going." James swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "Just for a walk," he replied evenly, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "No need to worry about me." But the teenager wasn't satisfied. He smirked, glancing back at his friends for approval before turning his attention back to James. "A walk, huh? You sure you're not hiding something?" Another boy chimed in, laughing loudly. "Yeah, maybe he's got treasure in that bag of his. Let's check." The suggestion sent the group into fits of hysterical laughter, their voices echoing through the park like a cruel soundtrack to James's growing unease. Despite their taunts, James stood his ground, refusing to give them the reaction they craved. He shifted his weight slightly, preparing to move forward, when one of the boys darted forward and gave him a light shove. It wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it was enough to unbalance him. James stumbled backward, his breath hitching as his chest tightened even more. This time, there was no denying it. The telltale signs of an asthma attack were setting in. His grip on the inhaler in his pocket tightened, his fingers trembling slightly as he realized how dire the situation could become. Unbeknownst to James, however, someone else had taken notice of the unfolding drama. From beneath the shade of a towering oak tree nearby, a pair of sharp eyes watched intently, assessing the scene with practiced precision. The figure remained still, observing every movement, every word exchanged between James and the teenagers. Something about the way the group closed in on him, their body language shifting from playful mischief to outright hostility, set off alarm bells. Whoever this silent observer was, they clearly understood that what started as harmless teasing had crossed a line, and they weren't about to stand idly by. The days following the incident brought a wave of change to the small town, rippling outward from the park where James's encounter with the teenagers had unfolded. News of what happened spread like wildfire, sparking conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces. For many residents, it was more than just gossip. It was a wake-up call. Parents began asking their children tough questions about how they treated others, while teachers incorporated discussions about empathy and accountability into their lessons. Even local businesses got involved, hanging posters promoting kindness and respect in their windows. James, meanwhile, found himself at the center of this growing movement, though he hadn't sought the attention. The paramedics who had checked on him encouraged him to rest for a few days, but instead of retreating into solitude, James felt compelled to share his story. He reached out to Sarah first, leaving a heartfelt message at the Royal Guard station thanking her for her bravery. To his surprise, she responded personally, visiting him later that week with a bouquet of wildflowers and a handwritten note signed by several members of her unit. "We look out for each other," she told him simply, her words echoing the values she lived by. Their brief conversation left James deeply moved, reinforcing his belief in the goodness of people. Encouraged by Sarah's example, James decided to speak publicly about his experience. At first, the idea intimidated him. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he realized his voice could make a difference. He began attending community meetings, sharing not only the details of that fateful day, but also reflections on his life as a veteran dealing with chronic asthma. His speeches were humble yet powerful, filled with raw honesty that resonated with listeners of all ages. When he spoke about the fear he felt during the attack, heads nodded in understanding. And when he talked about the importance of standing up against injustice, applause erupted, echoing through packed auditoriums. His courage inspired others to come forward with their own stories. A young woman recounted how she had been bullied in high school for having a stutter, while an elderly man shared how strangers had once mocked him for using a cane. These personal accounts created a tapestry of shared experiences, reminding everyone present that no one was truly alone in their struggles. The meetings became spaces for healing, where people listened without judgment and offered support to one another. Local schools took notice too, launching anti-bullying campaigns inspired by James's story. Teachers organized workshops where students acted out scenarios involving conflict resolution and empathy. Posters featuring quotes like, "Kindness costs nothing," and "Stand up, speak out" adorned classroom walls. One particularly impactful initiative involved pairing older students with younger ones as mentors, fostering connections across age groups and encouraging mutual respect. For the teenagers involved in the incident, the consequences extended beyond community service and counseling sessions. Their actions became cautionary tales discussed openly in classrooms and youth groups. While some initially resented the attention, over time, they began to see it as an opportunity to grow. During one workshop, the boy who had snatched James's inhaler stood up and apologized publicly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't understand what I was doing," he admitted, "but now I know better, and I promise to do better." His apology earned him nods of approval from peers and adults alike, signaling a step toward redemption. As weeks turned into months, the town transformed in subtle yet meaningful ways. Neighbors greeted each other more warmly, strangers held doors open for one another, and acts of kindness, big and small, became part of daily life. Even the park where it all began seemed different somehow, its paths cleaner and its atmosphere lighter. On weekends, families gathered there for picnics, laughter replacing the tension that had once lingered in the air. For James, the changes weren't just external, they were internal too. Speaking out had given him a renewed sense of purpose, reigniting passions he thought he'd lost after retiring from the military. He started volunteering regularly at the Veterans Center, mentoring younger ex-servicemen struggling with physical or emotional challenges. He even joined a local gardening club, finding joy in nurturing plants much like he nurtured relationships within the community. Each new connection reminded him that resilience wasn't just about enduring hardships, it was about thriving despite them. And though Sarah returned to her duties shortly after the incident, her act of bravery remained etched in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Her intervention served as a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear uniforms. And so, the ripple effect of James's story continued to spread far beyond the borders of the small town, touching lives in ways no one could have anticipated. What had started as a single act of cruelty in a quiet park became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations and actions that reached neighboring communities and even larger cities. Local newspapers picked up the story, publishing articles that highlighted not only the incident itself, but also the positive transformations it inspired. One headline read, "A veteran's ordeal sparks a movement of kindness," capturing the essence of what had unfolded, a tale of adversity turned into opportunity. Social media played a significant role in amplifying the message. Videos of James speaking at community meetings went viral, drawing thousands of views and comments from people around the world. Many shared their own experiences of bullying or moments when they had stood up for someone in need. Others posted messages of gratitude, thanking James and Sarah for reminding them of the importance of compassion. Hashtags like #StandUpForKindness and #BeTheChange began trending, encouraging individuals to take small steps toward making their communities better places. Teachers used these stories in classrooms, showing students that one person's courage could inspire countless others. Back in the town where it all began, the changes were tangible and lasting. The anti-bullying campaigns initiated by local schools evolved into annual events, complete with guest speakers, art exhibits, and essay contests centered on themes of empathy and respect. Students who once dismissed such topics as irrelevant now embraced them, realizing how interconnected their actions were with the well-being of those around them. At one middle school, a group of 8th graders formed a kindness crew, organizing random acts of goodwill, like leaving encouraging notes in lockers or helping younger kids carry heavy backpacks. Their efforts earned praise from parents and teachers alike, proving that even simple gestures could create profound impacts. For the teenagers involved in the incident, the journey toward redemption was ongoing but hopeful. While some initially struggled with guilt and shame, they gradually found ways to channel their energy into positive outlets. The boy who had stolen James's inhaler joined a peer mentoring program, working closely with younger students to teach conflict resolution skills. Another girl from the group volunteered regularly at an animal shelter, finding solace in caring for creatures unable to defend themselves. These acts of service didn't erase their past mistakes, but they demonstrated growth, a willingness to learn from their errors and contribute meaningfully to society. James, too, experienced personal growth that extended beyond his newfound role as a public speaker. He discovered a passion for advocacy, partnering with organizations dedicated to supporting veterans and raising awareness about chronic illnesses like asthma. His speeches grew more polished yet remained deeply authentic, earning invitations to speak at conferences and events across the country. Each time he shared his story, he emphasized the importance of resilience, not just in overcoming challenges, but in using them as stepping stones to help others. "Life doesn't give us hardships to break us," he often said. "It gives them to show us our strength and to remind us we're never truly alone." Sarah, though busy with her duties as a member of the Royal Guard, stayed connected to the community she'd helped protect. She occasionally attended local events, always humbly deflecting praise while emphasizing the collective effort behind the town's transformation. Her presence served as a constant reminder that heroism wasn't limited to grand gestures. It lived in everyday choices to do what was right, even when it was difficult. When asked about her decision to intervene that day in the park, she simply smiled and said, "It's easy to stand by and watch. It's harder, but infinitely more rewarding, to step in." As months turned into years, the park where James's ordeal had taken place became a symbol of hope and renewal. A plaque was installed near the oak tree where Sarah had stood, commemorating the day a quiet veteran and a steadfast guard reminded everyone of the power of kindness and accountability. Families visited the spot often, reading the inscription aloud and discussing its lessons with their children. The park itself thrived under renewed care, its paths cleaner, its gardens more vibrant, and its atmosphere filled with laughter rather than tension. In the end, the story of James Callahan and Corporal Sarah Bennett wasn't just about a single moment of bravery. It was about the enduring impact of choosing compassion over indifference, action over silence. It was proof that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail if people came together with purpose and determination. And as the community center buzzed with quiet murmurs, as Sarah ushered the group of teenagers inside. The large open hall was usually reserved for local events, yoga classes, art exhibitions, and charity drives. But today it served a different purpose. Backup had arrived quickly, 2 officers from the local police department stepping in to take over the situation. They were calm but firm, their presence reinforcing the seriousness of what had happened. As they began questioning each teenager individually, Sarah stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. For the teens, the reality of their actions was starting to sink in. At first, they had tried to downplay the incident, insisting it was just a joke or no big deal. But as the officers pressed them for details, their excuses crumbled under scrutiny. One boy, visibly shaken, admitted that he hadn't realized how serious asthma attacks could be. Another girl confessed she'd only joined in because everyone else was doing it, her voice trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. Each confession painted a picture of ignorance and peer pressure, but none of that excused their behavior. Sarah listened intently, her expression unreadable, though her clenched jaw hinted at the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. Meanwhile, James sat on a bench outside the community center, still recovering from the ordeal. A paramedic had arrived shortly after Sarah called for backup, ensuring he was stable enough to avoid a trip to the hospital. Though physically exhausted, James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for Sarah's intervention, but also for the reminder that there were still people willing to stand up for others. He watched as parents were summoned one by one to collect their children, some arriving red-faced with embarrassment, others visibly angry at the trouble their kids had caused. The sight stirred something in him, a mix of pity and hope. Pity for the teens who had clearly lost their way, and hope that this experience might steer them onto a better path. When the initial chaos settled, Sarah approached James, her demeanor softer now that the immediate crisis had passed. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. Her voice carried genuine concern, free of judgment or pretense. James managed a weak smile, nodding slowly. "I'll be all right," he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you for everything." Sarah shook her head modestly, brushing off his gratitude with a small wave of her hand. "It's my job to help when I see something wrong," she said simply. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "But I'm glad I could step in. No one should have to go through what you did today." There was a sincerity in her words that resonated deeply with James. It wasn't just about stopping the bullies, it was about restoring dignity and reminding him, and everyone else involved, that kindness mattered. Before leaving, Sarah handed James a small card with her contact information scribbled neatly on the back. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out," she told him. "And take care of yourself, all right?" James accepted the card with a nod, tucking it carefully into his pocket like a treasured keepsake. As Sarah turned to leave, he called out softly, "Corporal Bennett." She paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Thank you," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. This time, she allowed herself a warm smile before walking away, her boots clicking softly against the pavement. Back at the park, news of the incident spread quickly. Word traveled fast in small towns, and within hours, nearly everyone knew about the veteran who had been targeted and the Royal Guard officer who had stepped in to protect him. Conversations erupted across coffee shops, grocery stores, and schoolyards. Some praised Sarah's bravery, calling her a real-life hero. Others expressed outrage at the teenager's behavior, demanding stricter consequences for bullying. Local authorities wasted no time addressing the issue, announcing plans to implement anti-bullying workshops in schools and increase patrols around public spaces like the park. As for the teenagers, they faced a range of penalties designed to hold them accountable while offering opportunities for growth. Community service hours were assigned, requiring them to clean parks, assist at shelters, and participate in programs aimed at fostering empathy and responsibility. Mandatory counseling sessions were also arranged, giving them a chance to reflect on their actions and understand the impact of their choices. For many of them, these experiences became turning points, moments when they realized the weight of their behavior and vowed to do better. By evening, the park was quiet once again, the golden hues of sunset casting long shadows across the paths where the confrontation had taken place. James returned. The show had been light, almost playful in its delivery, but for James, it felt like a punch to the gut, not because of the physical impact, but because of what it triggered inside him. His chest tightened further, each breath becoming shallower and more labored. He steadied himself against a nearby bench, his fingers gripping the edge as he tried to focus on calming down. The teenagers, however, showed no signs of letting up. Their laughter grew louder, more mocking, as if they were enjoying some private joke at his expense. "Aw, look at Grandpa struggling." One of them jeered, pointing at James with exaggerated gestures that made the others howl with amusement. Another chimed in, "Maybe he's just tired from carrying all those war medals." The comment was met with snickers, though none of them truly understood or cared about the weight James carried, both physically and emotionally. To them, he was just an easy target, someone older and quieter who wouldn't fight back. James ignored their words as best he could, focusing instead on reaching for his inhaler. It was tucked safely in his jacket pocket, a small device that represented so much more than medicine. It was his lifeline, his safety net when the world pressed too heavily on his lungs. But before he could pull it out, disaster struck. One of the boys, emboldened by the group's growing confidence, lunged forward and snatched the inhaler right out of his hand. "Hey, what's this?" the boy said, holding the inhaler up triumphantly, as though he'd just discovered treasure. "Your little magic wand." He waved it around dramatically, earning cheers from his friends. "Think fast, old man," he taunted, tossing the inhaler to another member of the group. They began passing it back and forth, treating it like a game while James stood frozen, his breathing growing more strained with every passing second. Each toss of the inhaler felt like a cruel twist of fate, a reminder of how vulnerable he was in that moment. James tried to reason with them, his voice weak but steady. "Please," he said, holding out his hand. "I need that. It's important." But his plea only fueled their amusement. "Oh, listen to him beg," one of them mocked, clutching their stomach, as if James's distress was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. Another added, "Yeah, maybe we should charge him for it. What's it worth to you, Grandpa?" The situation spiraled further out of control as the teens continued their game, oblivious to the danger they were creating. James's vision blurred slightly, his body screaming for relief that wasn't coming. Each shallow breath felt like fire in his lungs, and beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. Still, he refused to panic. He knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he leaned heavily against the bench, trying to conserve what little energy he had left. Unbeknownst to James, the silent observer under the oak tree had seen enough. Corporal Sarah Bennett, a member of the Royal Guard stationed nearby, had been watching the entire scene unfold. Her initial curiosity had quickly turned into concern, and now her concern was morphing into anger. She clenched her fists subtly, her training kicking in as she assessed the situation. These weren't just rowdy kids having fun. They were bullies, plain and simple, and their actions were putting someone's life at risk. Sarah stepped forward, her polished boots crunching softly against the gravel path. Though she moved quietly, her presence commanded immediate attention. The sound of her approach caused the teenagers to falter mid-laugh, their heads snapping toward her in unison. When they saw her uniform, the crisp lines, the iconic bearskin hat, they froze, unsure of what to do next. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by James's ragged breathing. Sarah didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, her posture straight and commanding, her eyes scanning the group with an intensity that made them shift uncomfortably. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The question hung in the air, heavy with authority. One of the boys muttered defensively, "We're just messing around." But Sarah's gaze hardened, cutting through his excuse like a knife. "Messing around doesn't involve stealing someone's medication," she replied sharply, nodding toward James, who was still leaning against the bench, struggling to breathe. Without waiting for a response, she strode over to where the inhaler lay discarded on the ground, abandoned during the chaos. Picking it up gently, she walked over to James and handed it to him, ensuring he could use it before turning her full attention back to the group. Though the confrontation was far from over, Sarah's arrival marked a turning point. For James, it was a lifeline, not just in the form of his inhaler, but in the form of someone willing to stand up for him when he needed it most. And for the teenagers, it was the